this upscaling from individual small-scale experiments to large-scale implications is what I really get a lot of joy out of.
The diet of different bacteria varies a lot, something that can affect how much carbon dioxide is stored for a long time at the bottom of the ocean. This finds researchers from, for example, SciLife Lab, Uppsala University and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in a recent study.
People think about carbon uptake and photosynthesis, they typically think of plants, and that's because we see them every day, and that makes entirely sense. But I think what I want to give people as takeaway message is ultimately that the oceans are equivalently and perhaps even more important in some of these processes, where much of this carbon that we are emitting right now as humans is being taken up by many of these organisms and really fuels these entire ecosystems.
So carbon dioxide, CO2, is taken up by the ocean, but how does this work?
So the idea is similar to a forest. Ultimately, carbon is being taken up by leaves and plants through the assimilation of light at the same time and water, and this builds biomass, right? So this tree grows and ultimately then it decays. And that process ultimately also happens in the ocean. In the ocean, however, we don't have a forest floor. We have a floor that is 4,000 to 10,000 meters deep, so very, very deep. So what happens when kind of these microscopic trees at the surface die, they start to sink, and they sink and sink and sink. And carbon sequestration tells us something about how much of that carbon that is fixed at the very top of the ocean ultimately makes it way to the bottom. And that's an important process to understand because once it reaches that depth, once it is very, very far down on the sediment of the ocean, it can stay there for thousands of years. So basically up to 10,000 years before it actually comes up again. So the amount of carbon that is stored by these organisms, up to 5 to 30% of the total CO2 that is being taken up through photosynthesis by these microscopic plants, is ultimately converted into these fat storage or lipid molecules. So understanding how they are degraded and transported by bacteria has significant implications for our understanding how ultimately the global climate will respond and how much carbon is being taken up by our oceans.
But not all carbon that is fixed through photosynthesis makes its way to the bottom of the ocean.
They're also eaten by bacteria on the way down there. And this is what is called the biological carbon pump. And that ultimately dictates a lot of the carbon that is being recirculated in this particular system. Basically anything that's digestible in the ocean is being eaten by bacteria. What you see is that, if you do this with 20 bacteria, not everyone likes the same fat storage compounds. So some like specific classes of lipids and others like others. And some don't like to eat lipids at all. And so this kind of very highly resolved view on the dietary preference of bacteria tells us about something, their ability to utilize that actually in the ocean itself. But what is important to recognize is that bacteria also fuel ecosystems. They are taking that carbon and fixating it. They become another piece of biomass that is then taken up by another organism and so on.
So the researchers found huge variation in how much fat storage molecules, lipids, are degraded by different bacteria. This leads to better estimates of how much carbon dioxide is sequestered to the bottom of the ocean. Right now, this is not included when calculating the global uptake of carbon dioxide.
Often in these global carbon estimate models, right, say the microbial component, if even existing, is probably one number. And that's typically a rate, that tells us about how much of that carbon, when it enters an ecosystem, is being brought to the bottom of the ocean. So this complexity of this process that we described is really, in most models, currently represented as a single rate number. My hope is that the incorporation of a bit more granularity here, where we can look at, for example, how interactions or in specific geographic locations, maybe these might be different. We might be able to do a real contribution to improving the accuracy of some of these models.
This project took 9 years to complete. To achieve results like these, Lars now calls for restructuring of how research is funded.
And what I want to highlight here from personal experiences at least, that I think this takes time. And I think to really achieve, really fundamental science and insights into a very complex process, such as many biological processes, requires not these short-term funding schemes, but really long-term funding in more ambitious projects that allow us to continue to work on this. I wouldn't have been able to do this without being employed here. This would have not been published. And so I think there's an advocacy for a little more long-term view on funding ultimately.